So the this is the technology of teaching, and I'll be reading Chapter 3, Teaching Machines. There are more people in the world than ever before, and a far greater part of them want an education. The demand cannot be met simply by building more schools and training more teachers. Education must become more efficient. So, education must become more efficient. To this end, curricula must be revised and simplified, and textbooks and classroom techniques improved. In any other field, a demand for increased production would have led at once to the invention of labor-saving capital equipment. Education has reached this stage very late, possibly through a misconception of its task. Thanks to the advent of television, however, the so-called audio-visual aids are being re-examined. Film projectors, television sets, phonographs, and tape recorders are finding their way into American schools and colleges. Audiovisual aids supplement and may even supplant lectures, demonstrations, and textbooks. In doing so, they serve one function of the teacher. They present material to the student, and when successful, make it so clear and interesting that the student learns. There is another function to which they contribute little or nothing. It is best seen in the productive interchange between teacher and student in the small classroom or tutorial situation. Much of that interchange has already been sacrificed in modern education in order to teach large numbers of students. There is a real danger that it will be wholly obscured if use of equipment designed simply to present material becomes widespread. The student is becoming more and more a mere passive receiver of instruction. Another kind of capital equipment will encourage the student to take an active role in the instructional process. The possibility was recognized in the 1920s when Sidney L. Pressey designed several machines for the automatic testing of intelligence and information. A recent model of one of these is shown in Figure 3. So let's see if this shows up on the camera. Yeah, that shows up pretty well. So that's the automated testing machine. This was written before computers were widespread. In using the device, the student refers to a numbered item in a multiple-choice test. He presses the button corresponding to his first choice of answer. If he is right, the device moves on to the next item. If he is wrong, the error is tallied, and he must continue to make choices until he is right. And he's got a footnote here. The Navy's self-rater is a larger version of Pressey's machine. The items are printed on code-punched plastic cards fed by the machine. the time required to answer is taken into account in scoring. Okay. So such machines, Pressey pointed out, could not only test and score, they could teach. When an examination is corrected and returned after a delay of many hours or days, the student's behavior is not appreciably modified. The immediate report supplied by a self-scoring device, however, can have an important instructional effect. Pressey also pointed out, that such machines would increase efficiency in another way. Even in a small classroom, the teacher usually knows that he is moving too slowly for some students and too fast for others. Those who could go faster are penalized, and those who should go slower are poorly taught and unnecessarily punished by criticism and failure. Machine instruction would permit each student to proceed at his own rate. So all of these things are being done by Khan Academy. Although the question remains of whether they're doing it as good as it could possibly be done. The quote-unquote industrial revolution in education, which Pressey envisioned, stubbornly refused to come about. In 1932, he expressed his disappointment, and then now a quote follows from Pressey. The problems of invention are relatively simple. With a little money and engineering resource, a great deal could easily be done. The writer has found from bitter experience, and here's referring to himself, Pressey, the writer has found from bitter experience that one person alone can accomplish relatively little, and he is regretfully dropping further work on these problems. But he hopes that enough may have been done to stimulate other workers, that this fascinating field may be developed. Now Skinner picks up again. Pressey's machines succumbed in part to cultural inertia. The world of education was not ready for them. That's a very important point. That something has to be overcome. But they also had limitations, which probably contributed to their failure. Pressey was working against a background of psychological theory which had not come to grips with the learning process. The study of human learning was dominated by the memory drum and similar devices originally designed to study forgetting. I don't know what the memory drum is. Rate of learning was observed, but little was done to change it. Why the subject of an experiment bothered to learn at all was of little interest. Frequency and recency theories of learning and principles of massed and spaced practice concerned the conditions under which the responses were remembered. So he basically is saying that everybody was talking about memory at that time, right? And not learning. And so because of that cultural environment, he didn't get that much attention. So anyway, to continue. Pressey's machines were designed against this theoretical background. As versions of the memory drum, they were primarily testing devices. They were to be used after some amount of learning had already taken place elsewhere. By confirming correct responses and by weakening responses which should not have been acquired, a self-testing machine does indeed teach, but it is not designed primarily for that purpose. Nevertheless, Pressey seems to have been the first to emphasize the importance of immediate feedback in education and to propose a system in which each student could move at his own pace. He saw the need for capital equipment in realizing these objectives. Above all, he conceived of a machine which, in contrast with the audiovisual aids which were beginning to be developed, permitted the student to play an active role. So these are things Pressey did right. The need for capital equipment permitted the student to play an active role, and the importance of immediate feedback. Okay, so now he's got a subheading, other kinds of teaching machines. At the bottom here, other kinds of teaching machines. The learning process is now much better understood. Much of what we know has come from studying the behavior of lower organisms, but the results hold surprisingly well for human subjects. The emphasis in this research has not been on proving or disproving theories, but on discovering and controlling the variables of which learning is a function. The variables of which learning is a function. What does that mean? I'm going to circle that. Okay, I think what that means is the variables that affect learning. The variables of which learning is a function just means the variables which affect or produce learning. This practical orientation has paid off, for a surprising degree of control has been achieved. By arranging appropriate contingencies of reinforcement, specific forms of behavior can be set up and brought under the control of specific classes of stimuli. The resulting behavior can be maintained in strength for long periods of time. A technology based on this work has already been put to use in neurology, pharmacology, nutrition, psychophysics, psychiatry, and elsewhere. You should check this out. The analysis is also relevant to education. A student is taught in the sense that he is induced to engage in new forms of behavior and in specific forms upon specific occasions. It is not merely a matter of teaching him what to do. We are as much concerned with the probability that appropriate behavior will indeed appear at the proper time, an issue which would be classified traditionally under motivation. In education, the behavior to be shaped and maintained is usually verbal, and it is to be brought under the control of both verbal and nonverbal stimuli. Fortunately, the special problems raised by verbal behavior can be submitted to a similar analysis. If our current knowledge of the acquisition and maintenance of verbal behavior is to be applied to education, some sort of teaching machine is needed. Contingencies of reinforcement which change the behavior of lower organisms often cannot be arranged by hand. Rather elaborate apparatus, that's a word I don't use very often. Contingencies of reinforcement which change the behavior of lower organisms often cannot be arranged by hand. Rather, elaborate apparatus is needed. The human organism requires even more subtle instrumentation. An appropriate teaching machine will have several important features. An appropriate teaching machine. The student must compose his response rather than select it from a set of alternatives, as in a multiple choice self-rater. So that's something that Khan Academy does, I think. At least some of the time they have multiple choice. One reason for this is that we want him to recall rather than recognize, to make a response as well as see that it is right. Wow, that's really important. Another reason is that effective multiple choice material must contain plausible wrong responses, which are out of place in the delicate process of shaping behavior because they strengthen unwanted forms. Interesting. And he's got a footnote here. It's a quote. Who is he quoting? I don't know who he's quoting, but I'll read it anyway. So this is a footnote regarding the sentence I just read. So, quote, "Those who have written multiple choice tests know how much time, energy, and ingenuity are needed to construct plausible wrong answers. They must be plausible, or the test will be of little value. In a multiple choice test, they may do no harm, since a student who has already learned the right answer may reject wrong answers with ease, and possibly with no undesirable side effects. The student who is learning, however, can scarcely avoid trouble. Traces of erroneous responses survive in spite of the correction of errors or the confirmation of a right answer. In multiple choice material designed to teach literary appreciation, for example, the student is asked to consider 3 or 4 plausible paraphrases of a passage in a poem and to identify the most acceptable. But as the student reads and considers unacceptable paraphrases, the very processes the poet used to get an effect are at work to destroy it. Neither the vigorous correction of wrong answers nor the confirmation of a right choice will free the student of the verbal and nonverbal associations thus generated." This is interesting. This is related to the LSAT. Because answers would mess with your brain. And the footnote continues. Scientific subjects offer more specific examples. Consider an item such as the following, which might be part of a course in high school physics. The question goes, as the pressure of a gas increases, volume decreases. This is because A, the space between the molecules grows smaller, B, the molecules are flattened, C, etc. Unless the student is as industrious and as ingenious as the multiple choice programmer, it will probably not have occurred to him that molecules may be flattened as a gas is compressed. If he chooses item B and is corrected by the machine, we may say that he has learned that it is wrong, but this does not mean that the sentence will never occur to him again. And if he is unlucky enough to select the right answer first, his reading of the plausible but erroneous answer will be corrected only by implication. I don't know what that means. An equally vague and presumably less effective process. In either case, he may later find himself recalling that somewhere he has read that molecules are flattened when a gas is compressed. And of course, somewhere he has. Anyway, so that's the end of that footnote. So to go back to the main paragraph, he was talking about how wrong multiple choice answers strengthen unwanted behavior. And he continues, Although it is much easier to build a machine to score multiple choice answers than to evaluate a composed response, the technical advantage is outweighed by these and other considerations. Interesting. A second requirement of a minimal teaching machine also distinguishes it from earlier versions. In acquiring complex behavior, the student must pass through a carefully designed sequence of steps, often of considerable length. Each step must be so small that it can always be taken. Yet in taking it, the student moves somewhat closer to fully competent behavior. So you could call that the Google-like technical problem to be solved. How do you do that? Consistently. How do you do that consistently? And it says that the machine must make sure that these steps are taken in a carefully prescribed order. Interesting. Several machines with the required characteristics have been built and tested. Sets of separate presentations or frames of visual material are stored on disks, cards, or tapes. One frame is presented at a time, adjacent frames being out of sight. In the machine shown in Figure 2, page 25, so that's this one, so in that machine, the student composes a response by moving printed figures or letters, and his setting is compared by the machine with a coded response. So I lost track of my thought for a second. So the student composes a response by moving printed figures or letters, and his setting is compared by the machine with a coded response. Okay, I get that. So it's basically like a simple computer. For more advanced students from junior high school, say, through college, such a machine is unnecessarily rigid in specifying form of response. Fortunately, such students may be asked to compare their responses with printed material revealed by the machine. In the machine shown in Figure 4, material is printed in 30 radial frames on a 12-inch disc. Figure 4. So in the machine shown in Figure 4, material is printed in 30 radial frames on a 12-inch disc. The student inserts the disc and closes the machine. He cannot proceed until the machine has been locked, and once he has begun, the machine cannot be unlocked. All but a corner of one frame is visible through a window. The student writes his response on a paper strip exposed through a second opening. By lifting a lever on the front of the machine, he moves what he has written under a transparent cover and uncovers the correct response in the remaining corner of the frame. I'm not really understanding this. If the two responses correspond, he moves the lever horizontally. This movement punches a hole in the paper opposite his response, recording the fact that he called it correct. So basically he has to grade himself. So this movement punches a hole in the paper opposite his response, recording the fact that he called it correct, and alters the machine so that the frame will not appear again when the student works around the disk a second time. Whether the response was correct or not, a second frame appears when the lever is returned to its starting position. I guess that means a second question. The student proceeds in this way until he has responded to all frames. He then works around the disk a second time, but only those frames appear to which he has not correctly responded. When the disk revolves without stopping, the assignment is finished. So this is like a rudimentary version of Anki. The student is asked to repeat each frame until a correct response is made, to allow for the fact that in telling him that a response is wrong, such a machine tells him what is right. So now the caption for figure 4 that shows that record player type machine. It says, machine first used to teach part of the author's course at Harvard University. An indexing phonograph to supply auditory stimuli is shown on the right. Oh, so the thing on the right is a record player. Indexing phonograph. I don't know what indexing phonograph means. I guess that means that you can go to a particular part of it. And so really it's the device on the left. The device, or yeah, the device on the left is the actual machine. It says material is printed on the segments of a disk. The student inserts a disk in the machine and closes it. The machine cannot then be opened until he has completed the work. One frame of material appears in the window near the center. Window near the center. One frame of material appears in the window near the center. The student writes his response on a strip of paper exposed at the right. Student writes his response on the hole to the right of that one. By lifting a lever at the left of the front side of the machine, which is not visible, as far as I can tell, or I think just barely visible. So anyway, by lifting a lever at the left of the front side of the machine, the student moves the response he has written under a transparent cover and uncovers the correct response in the upper corner of the central frame. If his response is correct, he moves the lever to the right, thus punching a hole alongside the response he has called correct, and altering the machine so that that frame will not appear again when he works around the disk a second time. When the lever is returned to its starting position, a new frame appears. This machine was demonstrated at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association, September 1957. And I think that this is actually a great example of why it's now a great time to try to make these types of machines, because previously it wasn't possible, and now it is possible. So to continue. When the machine was designed, the power of programming had not yet been fully appreciated. It was assumed that the student would, and here he's not talking about computer programming, he's talking about programmed instruction. So the power of programming had not yet been fully appreciated. It was assumed that the student would make many mistakes and would need to see many frames a second time. The machine was, in fact, designed to require 2 correct responses to each frame, if necessary. As programming improved, a second chance became less important, A simpler machine was devised which had other advantages. A set of frames was not limited by the number of spaces on a disk. A set of frames, I don't know what that means. Frames were larger. Okay, that I understand. And so on. Such a machine is shown in Figure 5. Okay. So Figure 5 is the new and improved version. Still totally mechanical. The material is stored on fan-folded paper tapes, and the student writes on a separate strip. He sees printed material in the large window at the left and writes his response on the uncovered strip at the right. Let's show that one more time. By moving a slider, he then covers the response he has written with a transparent mask and uncovers additional material in the larger opening. This may tell him that his response is wrong without telling him what is right. For example, it may list a few of the commonest errors, one of which may be his response. He makes a second response, if necessary, on a newly uncovered portion of the paper strip. He makes a second response, if necessary, on a newly uncovered portion of the paper strip. Okay. This is covered by a further operation of the machine, which uncovers the correct response. He records an error by punching a hole alongside his response, leaving a record for the instructor and operating a counter which becomes visible at the end of the set. The student may record the number of mistakes he has made and perhaps compare it with a par score. The machine itself, of course, does not teach. It simply brings the student into contact with the person who composed the material it presents. It is a labor-saving device because it can bring one programmer into contact with an indefinite number of students. This may suggest mass production, but the effect upon each student is surprisingly like that of a private tutor. The comparison holds in several respects. Number one, there is a constant interchange between program and student. Unlike lectures, textbooks, and the usual audio-visual aids, the machine induces sustained activity. The student is always alert and busy. Number two, like a good tutor, the machine insists that a given point be thoroughly understood, either frame by frame or set by set, before the student moves on. Lectures, textbooks, and their mechanized equivalents, on the other hand, proceed without making sure that the student understands and easily leave him behind. Number three, like a good tutor, the machine presents just that material for which the student is ready. It asks him to take only that step which he is at the moment best equipped and most likely to take. Number four, like a skillful tutor, the machine helps the student to come up with the right answer. It does this in part through the orderly construction of the program and in part with such techniques as hinting, prompting, and suggesting, derived from an analysis of verbal behavior. Number five, lastly, of course, the machine, like the private tutor, reinforces the student for every correct response, using this immediate feedback not only to shape his behavior most efficiently, but to maintain it in strength in a manner which the layman would describe as holding the student's interest. It's very good information. So now there's another subsection, programmed materials. You can't really read it. But. So that subsection, I believe, was called other kinds of teaching machines. So he started by talking about this one guy's teaching machine, Pressy, and then he started talking about his own two teaching machines, and now he's going to programmed materials. The success of such a machine depends on the material used in it. The task of programming a given subject is at first sight rather formidable. Many helpful techniques can be derived from a general analysis of the relevant behavioral processes, verbal and nonverbal. Specific forms of behavior are to be evoked, and through differential reinforcement, brought under the control of specific stimuli. This is not the place for a systematic review of available techniques, or of the kind of research which may be expected to discover others. However, the machines themselves cannot be adequately described without giving a few examples of programs. Okay. We may begin with a set of frames, see Table 1, designed to teach a 3rd or 4th grade pupil to spell the word manufacture. The 6 frames are presented in the order shown, and the pupil moves sliders to expose letters in the open squares. It's probably going to be hard to read that here, but yeah, you can't really read it. So it says, Table 1. A set of frames designed to teach a 3rd or 4th grade pupil to spell the word manufacture. Step 1. Manufacture means to make or build. And then it has in italics, chair factories manufacture chairs. Copy the word here. And then it has these series of empty squares. Step 2. Part of the word is like part of the word factory. Both parts come from an old word meaning make or build. And then it has the word manufacture, but with these 4 squares empty, where I guess you write F-A-C-T. Step 3. Part of the word is like part of the word manual. Both parts come from an old word for hand. Many things used to be made by hand. And then it has these empty squares where you should write M-A-N-U. Step 4. The same letter goes in both places. And then he has the A missing from manufacture. And then in step 5, so these are different frames. They're not in a sequence. They're just to be shown individually. And then the 5th frame says, the same letter goes in both spaces. And that has the U missing from manufacture. And then the 6th frame says, chair factories blank chairs. And then the answer is manufacture. Chair, you can't really read it. But basically, the student is just filling in the letters. So to continue the text, the word to be learned appears in boldface in frame 1, with an example and a simple definition. The pupil's first task is simply to copy it. When he does so correctly, frame 2 appears. He must now copy selectively. He must identify fact as the common part of manufacture and factory. This helps him to spell the word and also to acquire a separable atomic verbal operant. In frame 3, another root must be copied selectively from manual. In frame 4, the pupil must, for the first time, insert letters without copying the full word. Since he is asked to insert the same letter in 2 places, a wrong response will be doubly conspicuous, and the chance of failure is thereby minimized. The same principle governs frame 5. In frame 6, the pupil spells the word to complete the sentence used as an example in frame 1. Even a poor student is likely to do this correctly, because he has just composed or completed the word 5 times, has made 2 important root responses, and has learned that 2 letters occur in the word twice. He has probably learned to spell the word without having made a mistake. So good. This is a great example of how B.F. Skinner would teach people. So it says, teaching spelling is mainly a process of shaping complex forms of behavior. In other subjects, for example, arithmetic, the same machine can be used to bring responses under control of appropriate stimuli. Unfortunately, the material which has been prepared for teaching arithmetic does not lend itself to excerpting. The numbers 0 through 9 are generated in relation to objects, quantities, and scales. The operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division are thoroughly developed before the number 10 is reached. In the course of this, the pupil composes equations and expressions in a great variety of alternative forms. He completes not only 5 plus 4 equals blank, but also blank plus 4 equals 9, 5 blank 4 equals 9, and so on, aided in most cases by illustrative materials. No appeal is made to rote memorizing, even in the later acquisition of the tables. The student is expected to arrive at 9 times 7 equals 63, not by memorizing it, as he would memorize a line of poetry, but by putting into practice such principles as that 9 times a number is the same as 10 times the number minus the number. Both of these being obvious or already well learned. That the digits in a multiple of 9 add to 9, so these continuing to list heuristics that they would have known, that in composing successive multiples of 9, one counts backwards, 9, 18, 27, 36, and so on. That 9 times a single digit is a number beginning with 1 less than the digit. So 9 times 6 is 50-something. And possibly even that the product of the two numbers separated by only one number is equal to the square of the separating numbers minus 1. So the square of 8 already being familiar from a special series of frames concerned with squares. I'm skeptical that people would remember that. But anyway, so he says, programs of this sort run to great length. At 5 or 6 frames per word, 4 grades of spelling may require 20,000 or 25,000 frames, and 3 or 4 grades of arithmetic as many again. If these figures seem large, it is only because we are thinking of the normal contact between teacher and pupil. Admittedly, a teacher cannot supervise 10,000 or 15,000 responses made by each pupil per year. But the pupil's time is not so limited. In any case, surprisingly little time is needed. 15 minutes per day on a machine should suffice for each of these programs, the machines being free for other students for the rest of each day. It is probably because traditional methods are so inefficient that we have been led to suppose that education requires such a prodigious part of a young person's day. That's a good quote. I like that. It's a good quote. A simple technique used in programming material at the high school or college level by means of this machine shown in Figure 4 is exemplified in teaching a student to recite a poem. It's a new part. The first line is presented with several unimportant letters omitted. The student must read the line meaningfully and supply the missing letters. The second, third, and fourth frames present succeeding lines in the same way. In the fifth frame, the first line reappears with other letters also missing. Since the student has recently read the line, he can complete it correctly. He does the same for the second, third, and fourth lines. Subsequent frames are increasingly incomplete, and eventually, say after 20 or 24 frames, the student reproduces all 4 lines without external help, and quite possibly without having made a wrong response. The technique is similar to that used in teaching spelling. Responses are first controlled by a text, but this is slowly reduced, colloquially vanished, until the responses can be emitted without a text, each member in a series of responses being now under the intraverbal control of their members. Okay. Vanishing can be used in teaching other types of verbal behavior. Actually. Vanishing can be used in other types of verbal behavior. When a student describes the geography of part of the world, or the anatomy of part of the body, or names plants and animals from specimens or pictures, verbal responses are controlled by nonverbal stimuli. In setting up such behavior, the student is first asked to report features of a fully labeled map, picture, or object, and the labels are then vanished. Okay. In teaching a map, for example, the machine asks the student to describe spatial relations among geographical features, such as cities, countries, and rivers, as shown on a fully labeled map. There's a footnote which says, material designed to teach geography was demonstrated with the machine shown in Figure 4 at the meeting of the APA mentioned in the legend. Okay. He is then asked to do the same with a map in which the names are incomplete, or possibly lacking. Eventually, he is asked to report the same relations with no map at all. If the material has been well programmed, he can do so correctly. Instruction is sometimes concerned not so much with imparting a new repertoire of verbal responses as with getting the student to describe something accurately in any available terms. The machine can, quote, make sure the student understands a graph, diagram, chart, or picture by asking him to identify and explain its features, correcting him, of course, whenever he is wrong. Okay. In addition to charts, maps, graphs, models, and so on, the student may have access to auditory material. In learning to take dictation in a foreign language, for example, he selects a short passage on an indexing phonograph according to instructions given by the machine. Okay. He listens to the passage as often as necessary and then transcribes it. The machine then reveals the correct text. The student may listen to the passage again to discover the sources of any error. The indexing phonograph may also be used with the machine to teach other language skills, as well as telegraphic code, music, speech, parts of literary and dramatic appreciation, and other subjects. A typical program combines many of these functions. The set of frames shown in Table 2 is designed to induce the student of high school physics to talk intelligently and to some extent technically about the emission of light from an incandescent source. Okay, so here's the Table 2. So it says Table 2, part of a program in high school physics. The machine presents one item at a time. The student completes the item and then uncovers the corresponding word or phrase shown at the right. Okay, so it says sentence to be completed. The important parts of a flashlight are the battery and the bulb. When we turn on a flashlight, we close a switch which connects the battery with the blank. And then the word you're supposed to supply is bulb. Number 2, when we turn on a flashlight, an electric current flows through the fine wire in the blank and causes it to grow hot. And the word to be supplied is bulb. 3, when the hot wire glows brightly, we say that it gives off or sends out heat and blank, and the word to be supplied is light. Number 4, the fine wire in the bulb is called a filament. The bulb lights up when the filament is heated by the passage of a blank current. The word to be supplied is electric. Number 5, when a weak battery produces little current, the fine wire, or blank, does not get very hot. The word to be supplied is filament. Number 6, a filament which is less hot sends out or gives off blank light. The word to be supplied is less. Number 7, emit means send out. The amount of light sent out or emitted by a filament depends on how blank the filament is. Word to be supplied is hot. Number 8, the higher the temperature of the filament, the blank, the light emitted by it. Temperature to be the word to be supplied is brighter or stronger. Number 9, if a flashlight battery is weak, the blank in the bulb may still glow, but with only a dull red color. And the word to be supplied is filament. Number 10, the light from a very hot filament is colored yellow or white. The light from a filament which is not very hot is colored blank. The word to be supplied is red. Number 11, a blacksmith or other metal worker sometimes makes sure that a bar of iron is heated to a cherry red before hammering it into shape. He uses the blank of the light emitted by the bar to tell how hot it is. The answer is color. Number 12, both the color and the amount of light depend on the blank of the emitting filament or bar. Answer is temperature. Number 13, an object which emits light because it is hot is called incandescent. A flashlight bulb is an incandescent source of blank. The answer is light. So to continue to the main text, so it says a typical program combines many of these functions. The set of frames shown in Table 2 is designed to induce the student of high school physics to talk intelligently and to some extent technically about the emission of light from an incandescent source. In using the machine, the student will write a word or phrase to complete a given item, and then uncover the corresponding word or phrase shown here in the column at the right. Okay. The reader who wishes to get the feel of the material should cover the right-hand column with a card, uncovering each line only after he has completed the corresponding item. Oh, well, I didn't do that. Oh, well. So, several programming techniques are exemplified by the set of frames in Table 2. Technical terms are introduced slowly. For example, the familiar term fine wire in frame 2 is followed by a definition of the technical term filament in frame 4. Filament is then asked for in the presence of the non-scientific synonym in frame 5, and without the synonym in frame 9. In the same way, glow, give off light, and send out light in the early frames are followed by a definition of emit with a synonym in frame 7. Various inflected forms of emit then follow, and emit itself is asked for without a synonym, but in a helpful phrase in frame 30. And emitted and emission are asked for without help in frames 33 and 34. So, the relation between temperature and amount and color of light is developed in several frames before a formal statement using the word temperature is asked for in frame 12. Incandescent is defined and used in frame 13, is used again in frame 14, and is asked for in frame 15, the student receiving the thematic prompt from the recurring phrase incandescent source of light. A formal prompt is supplied by candle. In frame 25, the new response energy is easily evoked by the words form of, because the expression form of energy is used earlier in the frame. Energy appears again in the next two frames and is finally asked for. Oh wow, this goes on, but the table goes on. I only read the first page. It goes on to 35. The 35 questions, I only did up to 13. So energy appears again in the next two frames and is finally asked for without aid in frame 28. Frames 30 through 35 discuss the limiting temperatures of incandescent objects, while reviewing several kinds of sources. The figure 800 is used in 3 frames. 2 intervening frames then permit some time to pass before the response 800 is asked for. Unwanted responses are eliminated with special techniques. If, for example, the second sentence in frame 24 were simply, "It is a blank source of light," the 2 veries would frequently lead the student to fill the blank with strong or a synonym thereof. This is prevented by inserting the word powerful to make a synonym redundant. Similarly, in frame 3, the words heat and preempt the response heat, which would otherwise correctly fill the blank. The net effect of such material is more than the acquisition of facts and terms. Beginning with a largely unverbalized acquaintance with such things as flashlights and candles, the student is induced to talk about familiar events, together with a few new facts, with a fairly technical vocabulary. He applies the same terms to facts which he may never before have seen to be similar. The emission of light from an incandescent source takes shape as a topic or field of inquiry. An understanding of the subject emerges, which is often quite surprising in view of the fragmentation required in item building. Right. So this is not the end of chapter 3. It goes on for a long time. It goes on for another 40 pages. But I think I'm going to take a break here and pick up again on another day. I've done about 20 pages, so I think that's a pretty good rate. So I'll pick this up later.